My stepfather married my mom 2 years after killing my dad, and I'm the one who found the proof. I was 23 when my father died, and for the first year afterward, I genuinely believed the worst thing that could ever happen to my family had already happened. That grief had already taken its biggest bite out of us, and all that was left was the slow work of healing. I was wrong, obviously, or I wouldn't be writing this. But I want to start from the beginning, because I think the details matter. Because when I first started noticing things were off, I doubted myself for months, and I don't want anyone reading this to make the mistake I almost made, which was staying quiet. My dad, Marcus, was a paramedic who picked up night shifts at a private ambulance company to cover the mortgage after the plant where my mom worked cut her hours. He was 51, in decent shape, the kind of man who whistled old country songs while he changed the oil in the driveway on Saturdays. On a Tuesday night in March, he was walking the last 4 blocks home from the depot because his car was in the shop, and somewhere along Route 9, just past the closed hardware store, a vehicle hit him and didn't stop. He died before the paramedics, his own co-workers, some of them, even got there. The police found skid marks, a single broken taillight lens fragment, and a smear of black paint on the guardrail he'd been thrown against. No witnesses, no traffic cameras on that stretch of road, no leads. The case went cold within 6 weeks, and I remember the detective at the time, a tired man named Alvarez, telling my mother that hit-and-run cases without a plate number or a witness almost never close. We buried my dad in a cemetery near the community college where I was finishing my vet tech certification, and life, in the ugly, relentless way that it does, kept moving forward whether we wanted it to or not. My mother, Diane, fell apart in a way I hadn't expected from her. She'd always been the practical one, the one who balanced the checkbook and handled the insurance calls. But after Dad died, she stopped being able to function in ordinary ways. She'd forget to eat, forget to pick my little brother Tyler up from soccer, cry in the shower thinking none of us could hear her. Eventually, on the advice of her sister, she started attending a grief support group at the Lutheran church 2 towns over, and that's where she met Russell. I remember the night she brought him up for the first time, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, telling me and Tyler that she'd met someone at group, that his wife had died of ovarian cancer 3 years earlier, that he understood what it was like to lose someone without warning and have to keep raising kids anyway, because he had a grown daughter from his marriage who lived out of state. She looked so hopeful telling us this, so much lighter than she'd looked in over a year, that neither Tyler nor I had the heart to say what we were both thinking, which was that it felt fast, that 18 months wasn't very long, that Dad's side of the closet still had his flannel shirts in it. Russell turned out to be, by every visible measure, a genuinely decent man, or at least a very convincing performance of one. He was 54, ran his own small contracting business doing kitchen and bathroom remodels, drove a beat-up Ford pickup he was constantly tinkering with, and had that easy, unbothered confidence that comes from being handy with tools and comfortable in his own skin. He fixed the leaning fence in our backyard the first month he started coming around without anyone asking him to. He showed up to Tyler's junior varsity baseball games even before he and Mom were officially engaged, and he actually paid attention, actually remembered which kid on the team was the pitcher, and which one had a mean case of poison ivy that spring. He never tried to be my dad, never pushed, always called himself Russ instead of anything closer, and honestly, for a long time, I liked him. My mom married him 14 months after they met at that support group, which put the wedding at just under 2 years after my father's death, and I stood up as a bridesmaid and meant it when I said I was happy for her, because I was. I want to be clear about that, because later people accused me of jealousy, of resentment, of some Cinderella complex nonsense, and none of that was ever true. I liked Russ. That's what makes the rest of this so hard to write. It was maybe 8 months into the marriage, in the beginning of a new summer, when Russell drove home a truck he was clearly thrilled about, an old matte black Dodge Ram with a dented tailgate and a cracked side mirror, the kind of project vehicle a guy like him would genuinely enjoy restoring on weekends. He told us at dinner that he'd finally pulled it out of a storage unit he'd been paying for years, some old truck he used to drive before he met his first wife, said he was going to fix it up as a someday project, maybe hand it down to Tyler when he got his license. Nobody thought anything of it. I certainly didn't, not at first. It was maybe 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when I'd stopped by to borrow a ladder from the garage, that I actually looked at the truck up close for the first time, really looked at it, and noticed something that snagged in my brain the way a splinter does before you even feel the pain. The front right fender had a faint ripple in the metal, barely visible unless the light hit it a certain way, and the paint there was a slightly different shade of matte black than the rest of the body, newer, glossier in a way that hadn't fully weathered to match. I asked Russ about it, casually, the way you'd ask about anything, and he said offhand that he'd bought the truck used from a guy 3 towns over about 3 years back, before he even started dating my mom, and that it had some cosmetic damage he'd been meaning to sand down properly. 3 years back. I did the math without even meaning to. The way your brain sometimes solves a problem before you consciously decide to work on it. And 3 years back put that truck in Russell's possession a full year before my father was killed on Route 9. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself plenty of trucks have dents, plenty of paint jobs don't perfectly match, that grief makes people see patterns where there aren't any, and for almost 2 months I genuinely tried to let it go. But it kept nagging at me, the way something does when part of your brain has already decided it matters even if the rest of you is trying to talk it down. And one Saturday when Russ and my mom took Tyler to a lake house for the weekend and I stayed behind to watch the dog, I let myself into the garage with a flashlight and went looking. I'm not proud of it. I felt sick doing it, actually, like I was betraying someone who had never given me a real reason to distrust him, but I went through the metal filing cabinet where Russ kept his business paperwork and truck registration anyway, and near the back I found a manila folder with a repair invoice from an auto body shop, dated exactly 2 weeks after my father's death, itemizing bodywork and paint on the front passenger side fender and a replacement headlight assembly. Behind that was an insurance claim form, also dated within that same window, describing a collision with a deer on Route 9, the same road my father died on. During the same week my father was killed. I sat on the cold concrete floor of that garage for a long time after I found those papers, feeling like the ground had genuinely tilted underneath me, running through every innocent explanation I could think of and finding that none of them held up. A deer collision on the exact road in the exact week, followed by a hasty repair on a truck whose owner had lied to my face about how long he'd had it. None of that added up to coincidence. Not to me, not anymore. I photographed every document with my phone, put everything back exactly where I found it, and then I did something I probably shouldn't have, which was borrow the truck itself under the excuse of needing to haul a couch to the donation center, and drive it 40 minutes to see my old friend Danny, who worked at an independent auto body and collision shop and who I trusted more than I trusted almost anyone else in my life at that point. I told Danny everything, showed him the photos of the invoice, and asked him to look underneath the vehicle, at the undercarriage and wheel wells, for anything that might have survived 3 years of driving and 1 professional repair job. It took him almost 2 hours, methodically going over every inch with a work light and a mirror on a stick, and I remember standing there in the shop bay chewing the inside of my cheek raw, half hoping he'd find nothing so I could feel stupid and go home and never think about this again. He found something instead. Wedged up in the wheel well liner near the front passenger tire, snagged on a jagged piece of plastic clip, was a small torn fragment of fabric, dark navy with a strip of faded reflective material sewn into it, the exact kind of high-visibility safety strip sewn into the uniform shirts my father's ambulance company issued to its overnight staff. Danny looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, somewhere between concern and dread, and asked very quietly if I was sure I wanted to keep pulling on this thread, because whatever was on the other end of it wasn't going to be something I could unknow once I knew it. I told him I didn't have a choice anymore. Not really. Not once I'd seen that fragment of navy fabric with my own eyes, and thought about my father's uniform hanging in a bag in our hall closet, because none of us had been able to bring ourselves to donate it. The next morning I called the police department that had originally handled my father's case and asked, with my voice shaking more than I wanted it to speak to whoever had inherited the file, since Detective Alvarez had since retired. I was connected to a younger detective named Dylan Reyes, who I could tell from his tone was skeptical at first, the way anyone would be skeptical of a grieving daughter calling in with a theory about her own stepfather, but who agreed to meet with me that same afternoon after I mentioned the fabric fragment and the repair invoice dates. I brought him the photos on my phone, told him everything about the truck, the timeline, the insurance claim, and to his credit he didn't dismiss any of it, even though I could see him working hard to keep his expression neutral and professional. He told me that fabric alone wasn't enough for an arrest, that they'd need to actually recover the physical fragment and get it properly tested, and that the timeline of documents, while suspicious, could still theoretically be explained away by a decent defense attorney. I told him where the truck currently was, sitting in Danny's shop bay. And within 4 hours, Detective Reyes had a warrant signed and a forensics unit at the garage carefully extracting the fragment and swabbing the surrounding metal for any trace evidence that might have survived the years and the repair job. The DNA results took 11 days to come back. 11 of the longest days of my entire life, during which I said absolutely nothing to my mother or Tyler, because I honestly did not know how to say it. Did not know how you tell your mom that the man she married, the man who fixed her fence and remembered her son's poison ivy, might be the person who killed her first husband and then spent 2 years quietly, patiently working his way into their grief until he was sleeping in the same bed as his victim's widow. When Detective Reyes finally called to tell me the lab had gotten a partial DNA profile off the fabric, and it matched my father's known DNA on file from routine hospital records, I don't think I actually processed the words the first time he said them. I made him repeat it. Then I sat down on the curb outside the animal clinic where I worked and cried in a way I hadn't cried since the funeral. Not out of sadness exactly, but out of something closer to horror, because it meant every gentle, ordinary moment of the last 2 years, every fence repair, every Little League game, every casserole Russ had brought over during a rough week, had happened while he knew, while he'd always known, exactly what he'd done to us. The police arrested Russell 3 days later at one of his job sites, and I wasn't there for it. But Tyler was home when 2 patrol cars pulled up and Detective Reyes walked Russ out in handcuffs past our mother's driveway, and Tyler called me sounding like a much younger kid than 17, asking me over and over what was happening, why the police had Russ, whether this had something to do with why I'd been acting so strange for the past 2 weeks. I had to tell him over the phone, badly, clumsily, and I will never forgive myself for how I handled that conversation. But there was no good way to tell your little brother that the man he'd started calling Coach at his baseball games had run over their father and left him to die on the side of the road. My mother's reaction was worse than I could have prepared for, and looking back, I think some part of me had actually hoped she would just believe me right away, would trust the DNA results and the timeline and fall apart into my arms the way I'd fallen apart in Danny's garage. Instead, she went cold in a way I'd never seen from her. Drove straight to the police station, and when they wouldn't let her see Russ, she came home and accused me, to my face, of fabricating evidence because I'd never really accepted him, of planting that fabric myself, of being jealous of the happiness she'd finally found after my father's death. She said things that night I still think about at 3 a.m. sometimes, that I was punishing her for moving on, that I'd always resented her for remarrying, that I was willing to destroy her second chance at love out of some twisted, grief-fueled spite. I understand it now, or I'm trying to understand it, because I think some part of her needed it not to be true so badly that her mind simply refused the information, the way your hand yanks back from a stove before your brain even registers pain. But at the time, it felt like losing her too, like I'd lost my father, and now I was losing my mother in a different, slower way. And Tyler was caught in the middle, not knowing which of us to believe. 16 years old, and suddenly the only stable adult figure in the house had turned out to be a murderer, and his own sister was the one who'd proven it. My mother went so far as to take out a second mortgage on the house, nearly $50,000, to hire a private defense attorney for Russell, a fact I only learned when the bank called our house asking to verify her income, and I remember screaming at her over the kitchen table, asking her how she could possibly justify spending money we didn't have to defend the man who'd killed her husband, and her screaming back that Russ deserved a fair defense, that the system railroads innocent people all the time, that she believed him when he told her it was all some horrible misunderstanding involving a deer and a fender bender that had nothing to do with any of this. It took the actual criminal investigation, not my testimony, not the DNA, but the deeper background check Detective Reyes ran once Russell was formally charged, to finally crack that wall of denial. It turned out Russell had a history nobody in our family had ever known about, 2 prior hit-and-run incidents from years before he met my mother, both involving alcohol, both resulting in property damage and minor injuries rather than deaths, both of which he'd managed to settle quietly or avoid serious charges for through some combination of luck and a good lawyer at the time. More devastatingly, once the case made the local news, an older woman named Margaret Whitfield came forward, saying she'd been struck by a dark pickup truck 11 years earlier while walking her dog on a rural road, that she'd never been able to identify the driver, but that a torn scrap of dark paint transferred onto her jacket that night had sat in an evidence box for over a decade, and when investigators pulled it and compared it against samples from Russell's truck, the paint composition was a near-perfect match. Margaret had lived with a permanent limp for 11 years because of that night, and hearing her speak at a pre-trial hearing, describing what it felt like to finally have an answer after over a decade of silence, was the thing that I think finally broke through to my mother. Detective Reyes arranged for her to see the complete case file, every document, every photo, every piece of the timeline laid out chronologically, right there in a small conference room at the police station. And Tyler told me later that our mother sat in that room for almost 2 hours without saying a word. And when she finally came out, she looked like she'd aged 5 years in that single afternoon. She told me, much later, in one of the only real conversations we've had about it since, that the moment it finally became undeniable for her wasn't the DNA evidence or even Margaret's testimony, but a single detail buried in Russell's own phone records that the prosecution had subpoenaed, a search on his phone, made the very night of my father's death. For how long does paint take to dry? Time-stamped less than 2 hours after Marcus was struck on Route 9. She said that was the moment she stopped being able to construct any alternate version of events in her head, the moment she finally let herself understand that she had been sleeping beside the man who killed her husband for nearly 2 years, had let him raise her son, had let him walk her down memory lane about grief itself, while he sat on the exact secret that had caused it. The trial, when it finally happened almost a year after the arrest, was almost anticlimactic compared to everything that led up to it. Faced with the DNA match, Margaret's paint evidence, the insurance fraud paper trail, and his own phone records, Russell's attorney negotiated a plea in which Russell admitted to driving under the influence and striking my father, panicking, and fleeing the scene, though he continued to insist through his lawyer that he hadn't recognized the severity of the injury until it was too late to safely stop and render aid. A claim absolutely nobody in that courtroom believed for a second, given that he then spent 2 weeks quietly repairing his truck and filing a false insurance claim rather than ever once coming forward. The jury found him guilty on every count that went to trial: vehicular manslaughter, tampering with evidence, insurance fraud, and leaving the scene of a fatal accident. And the judge sentenced him to 12 years, factoring in his prior undisclosed hit-and-run history as an aggravating circumstance. I was in the courtroom when the sentence was read, sitting next to Tyler, who was 18 by then and had grown into a kind of quiet, watchful maturity that no 17-year-old should have to develop that fast. And my mother sat 2 rows back, alone, because by that point she and I still weren't fully speaking, still hadn't found our way back to each other despite everything. The aftermath was, in a lot of ways, harder than the investigation itself, because at least during the investigation, there had been a clear goal, a direction to move in, evidence to find, and once the trial ended, there was just the wreckage to sort through. The legal fees my mother had already sunk into Russell's defense before the plea deal meant we had to sell the house within the year. The same house I'd grown up in, the same driveway where my dad used to change his oil on Saturdays, and watching the sold sign go up in the front yard felt like losing him all over again in some smaller, quieter way. It was during the process of packing up that house, going through the small home office my father used to keep in the corner of the garage, that Tyler found a shoebox tucked behind some old tax files. And inside it were 4 sealed envelopes, one addressed to my mother, one to me, one to Tyler, and one simply marked, "Whoever finds this," all in my father's handwriting, all dated about 5 years before he died. It turned out my dad, after a scare with his blood pressure in his mid-40s, had gone through a period of thinking seriously about his own mortality, and had written each of us a letter just in case, then apparently forgotten about them entirely once his health scare passed and life moved on the way it does. Reading that letter, sitting on the floor of a garage that was about to belong to strangers, in my father's careful handwriting, telling me to take care of my mother and brother, to not let grief make us smaller people, to remember that the family he'd built was worth protecting even when it felt impossible, was one of the strangest and most important moments of grief I have ever experienced, both because of how uncannily timed it was and because of how much it forced all 3 of us, my mother included, to finally sit in the same room and cry together instead of around each other. It didn't fix everything overnight, And I want to be honest about that instead of wrapping this up with a bow it doesn't deserve. My mother and I are better now, genuinely better. But there's a scar tissue in our relationship that I don't think will ever fully disappear, a residue of the months she chose to believe a killer over her own daughter, and I've made a kind of peace with that scar rather than pretending it isn't there. Tyler struggled for a long time with trusting new people in his life, especially adult men who tried to be kind to him, because his frame of reference for kind adult male had been so thoroughly poisoned, though he's doing better now in his second year of community college, studying to become a paramedic himself, which felt like such a quiet, devastating tribute to our father that none of us said much about it out loud the day he told us. We just let it sit there, meaning what it meant. We moved into a smaller rental across town, the three of us, at least for a while before my mother eventually found her own place. And there was something almost healing about starting over somewhere that didn't have Russell's fingerprints on every doorframe and fence post, somewhere we could build new, smaller routines that belonged only to us. I still work at the veterinary clinic, still have Danny's number saved as the guy who found the fabric in my phone as a strange dark joke between us, and I still think, more often than I'd like to admit, about how close I came to talking myself out of ever investigating that truck in the first place. How easily this could have stayed buried forever if I'd just accepted the explanation about a mismatched paint job and moved on with my life the way most people probably would have. I think about Margaret Whitfield sometimes too, about the 11 years she spent not knowing, about how justice for her only arrived as an accidental byproduct of my own suspicion, and it makes me believe, in a way I didn't before any of this happened, that the truth really does have a way of surfacing eventually, even when it takes years, even when the person burying it is patient and careful and good at pretending. My father never got to meet the man who killed him brought to justice, never got to see his kids grow into the adults we're becoming, but I like to think that somewhere in writing those letters 5 years before he died, some part of him already knew that the people he loved would eventually find their way through whatever came, and I hold on to that thought on the nights when the anger and the grief still catch up to me all at once. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I'm honestly not sure there needs to be one, I think it's that trusting your gut when something feels wrong is worth the discomfort of possibly being wrong, because the alternative, staying quiet to keep the peace, to avoid being called paranoid or jealous or ungrateful, would have meant letting my father's killer keep sitting at our dinner table indefinitely, and no amount of social awkwardness is worth that price.